Hello, and welcome to the Hudson Schantz Show. I am your host, Hudson Schantz. Today, I want to talk to you about a topic that I believe doesn't get enough coverage in the mainstream media. That is congressional term limits. Now, before we jump into this complex, nuanced issue, I want to introduce you to some of the sources I'll be using. First, an article by Richard Epstein titled, "Why We Need Term Limits for Congress, 4 in the Senate, 10 in the House." My next source is an article by Ronald Rotunda and Stephen Safranek. It is titled Article 7, an essay on term limits and a call for a constitutional convention. Now my final source is a bit different. It's from the US Government Publishing Office. It's titled Congressional Term Limits, and essentially it's a summary of the opinions of various US senators from 1995. Now you may think, well, 1995, that's a bit outdated. However, many of the senators you hear from are actually still relevant in today's political climate. Now that may be a bit ironic considering I'm proposing congressional term limits, but we'll get into that later. I want to begin with some context so you understand the issue. Now, let's go all the way back to 1776. The United States declared their independence from Great Britain. Now, this was shocking to the rest of the world, as the United States was a small group of colonies going against Great Britain, the most powerful empire of all time. Now, the US ended up winning their independence. They won the American Revolution. And in 1789, 13 years after the Declaration of Independence was signed, the United States Constitution was ratified by the states and Congress. The United States Constitution essentially became the law of the land. It governed the government, which is extremely powerful. Now, since 1789, 27 different amendments have been passed. Now, what amendments do, they change something that was written in the Constitution. You may be familiar with the Bill of Rights, which is the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. Now, something important to note about presidential term limits. Presidential term limits were not added to the Constitution until after FDR's presidency. Now, as you may know, FDR served 4 terms as president. Up until him, no one had served more than 2. George Washington set the precedent to only serve a maximum of 2 terms as president. Because of World War II, FDR felt that he should stay as president because if there was an election, it would lead to instability. Now, after FDR died and he left office, Congress ratified a new amendment that would make 2 presidential term limits the max anyone can serve. But we're not here to talk about presidential term limits today. I want to talk about congressional term limits. Congressional term limits have never been added to the Constitution, and I want to tell you why they should. Now that you have some context about the issue of congressional term limits, I want to dive right into the topic. But before we talk about the pros and the cons of term limits, you first must understand how term limits will be implemented into our Constitution and, of course, into our government. Now, Richard Epstein cites a U.S. Supreme Court case that's titled U.S. Term Limits v. Thornton. This case happened a few decades ago, but it had significant impact. It ruled that states could not implement term limits on their representatives. Now, in this case, Arkansas was the state that tried to do such thing. They tried to put term limits on their senators and representatives at the federal level. The United States Supreme Court ruled that this was unconstitutional. It was not allowed. Now, Rotunda and Safranek also cite this case. They say that the case was ruled 5-4, so it was actually a close margin amongst the Supreme Court. And in the case, the Supreme Court stated that Article 5 of the Constitution must be used to implement term limits. Now, Article 5 outlines 2 distinct ways that an amendment can be added to the Constitution. Now, these 2 ways are a constitutional convention and the more typical method of simply Congress voting on it. Now, a constitutional convention has actually never happened. Every one of the 27 amendments happened through Congress without the need for the Constitutional Convention. But many argue because congressional term limits actually strip power from Congress, Congress would never do it themselves, so a constitutional convention is needed. Now, Epstein argues actually in favor of Congress doing it themselves because he says that a constitutional convention by the states is dangerous and unprecedented. However, Rotunda and Safranek argue for the Constitutional Convention because they think that Congress people would never actually vote to strip power for themselves. Now, while there is some disagreement about what the best method for implementing term limits would be, both Rotunda and Safranek and Epstein agree that either method is extremely difficult. There have only been 27 amendments passed since 1789. It's very difficult to add any amendment to the Constitution. Both of these methods are challenging, but it is possible. Now that you have a bit of context about the issue and also an understanding of why implementing congressional term limits is so difficult, I want to present to you both the pros and the cons for congressional term limits. I'm going to start with the pros and then later move into the cons. Now first, the U.S. Senate report states that 3/4 of Americans believe Congress should have term limits. Those numbers were from 1995, and I also can confirm that they are very similar in 2022, if not even more Americans want congressional term limits. So I would argue that if Americans want it, Congress is supposed to deliver to the people what the people actually want. This is a great argument in favor for congressional term limits. Richard Epstein says that 90% of incumbents get reelected each election cycle. So if 3/4 of Americans want congressional term limits, how come the same representatives keep getting elected every year? I'm here to tell you. Richard Epstein, he states that Congress is structured to give advantages to those with more tenure. Length in office offers a huge advantage to those seeking localized benefits. Now, if you don't already know, Congress, both the Senate and the House, is set up in a way that those who have served the longest actually have the most power. This is incentive for voters to keep voting in the same person over and over again so that they end up getting more tenure. Even if they are the worst candidate, it still might be better for the voter to vote in the person who has served the longest as opposed to a new representative who is the better option, but they'll actually have less power in Congress, making them the worst option. Senators Brown, Thompson, Kyle, and DeWine, they argue this in the Senate report. They state that entrenched incumbents who spend too much time in Washington lose touch with the will of the people. They're more concerned with pleasing the right people than casting the tough vote. Now, this is an argument that suggests that if you spend more time in Washington, you actually don't know what it's like to live with the people who you're representing. The whole point of Congress is that it's supposed to be a representation of the people. Each district has a representative that's supposed to represent them. It's supposed to represent their wants and their needs. But if you live in Washington all the time, how are you supposed to keep in touch with your people, let's say back in Arizona or back in Idaho, across the entire country? This is an argument in favor of, well, if we limit the amount of terms that someone can serve, they'll be more likely to actually be in touch with the people they're supposed to be representing. Now, that's the second part of that quote indicated that these representatives, they fall to the big donors and the big lobbyists who are getting them reelected each and every year. Essentially, these representatives are more focused on staying in power rather than keeping their promises to the people. This is very dangerous. It's a more nuanced issue than just term limits. It's all about money and politics. That's too much to get into now, but it is a very important issue and it ties directly into congressional term limits. Now, furthermore, Epstein argues that under the current rules, Congress people often come to power late in their careers. Now, this is because people who are younger are very unlikely to get congressional positions. This is because of the point I mentioned earlier with if you have more tenure, you have more power. More tenure equals more power. So if you're younger, you have less tenure because you've served less years, it means you're less likely to rise to power at a young age. This is probably why the median and mean age of Congress is so high relative to the US population. It's staggering numbers, and it's not an actual representation of the people. Now, finally, the same Senators Brown, Thompson, Kyle, and DeWine, argued that it's essential to let anyone participate in democracy, that our legislators be rotated out of office to live under their own commands. Anyone should be able to be a representative, and those representatives should know what it's like to live under their own laws. But when people serve 8, 10, 12 terms in Congress, they never actually know what it's like to live under the own laws that they're passing. That doesn't seem like a fair system. Additionally, because of the amount of money and the amount of lobbying that happens within Congress, it's very difficult for the average person, for the average mom or dad who maybe feels like they can represent their people. It's very difficult for those people to rise to Congress because they just don't have a chance against an incumbent with so much political backing. Now, those were the arguments in favor of congressional term limits. I also want to provide you with some arguments that go against congressional term limits, and I want to tell you why many of these arguments are not actually valid. Let's begin with Senator Hatch. If you don't know Senator Hatch, he is one of the longest reigning senators of all time. He is no longer currently serving, but that's only pretty recently. He was serving for a long time, up until a few years ago. Now, he argues that term limits would indiscriminately operate against both good and bad legislators. Now, this is true. This is a valid point. Let's say the people of Indiana love their senator so much. Well, term limits would prevent the people of Indiana from continuing to vote this person into Senate as their representative. This is a side effect of congressional term limits, and it's impossible to prevent. However, I would argue that if the people love their representative so much, there are other positions that this person can take. For example, if the people of Indiana love their senator, but because of term limits, he can't be a senator anymore, maybe he or she can run for governor, maybe even vice president or president. What I'm trying to say, there's other positions that someone can run for after they did their maximum amount of time in Congress. Now, a quote from Richard Epstein, you may be surprised because Richard Epstein argued in favor of congressional term limits earlier. He says that the people should choose whom they please to govern them. Now, this is a pretty abstract idea. It has a lot of implications, but it basically says that, well, if the people want someone to be their representative, why are we stripping that? I would point to an earlier Richard Epstein quote where he said that 90% of incumbents are reelected, even though 3 out of every 4 Americans want term limits. Now, what does this mean? Even though the same people keep getting reelected, it's not really what the American people want. Because of the money and the lobbyists that I talked about earlier, it's simply a side effect. It's not actually what the American people want. Now, Orrin Hatch also argues that term limits would make Congress people far more dependent on Capitol Hill staffers and special interest lobbyists. Now, I completely disagree with this. Hatch is trying to say that, well, if these representatives keep getting circulated in and out, the only people who are actually constant in Washington are the staffers and the lobbyists. Yes, that is true, but I would argue that if a congressperson were to stay in office a long time, they would build relationships with these staffers and these lobbyists, and as you stay in Congress longer, these relationships get stronger. I think if you circulate people in and out of Congress, there isn't quite enough time to build these relationships, so the lobbyists and the special interests, they can't really get their way as much as if there were no term limits, then it's the same people in office for so long, and these relationships, these dangerous relationships, can build. Now, furthermore, Hatch argues that without having congressional term limits, there's actually a clear basis for leadership in both the Senate and the House, and this is a stable system. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Congress, both the House of Representatives and the Senate, is organized in a way to give the people who have served for the longest time the most power. So this is a clear way of establishing, well, who the leaders will be and who the people who will have a smaller role, who those people will be. Yes, that is true. It is a clear way of establishing leadership. But what if it wasn't based on tenure instead of, well, who the representatives vote for? For example, if the majority of representatives believe that this person should be the Speaker of the House or maybe the majority leader, why should age play a factor into that? It should be the most qualified person gets to play the highest role. Similar to how most things work. Most things aren't worked by tenure or by age. I feel like that's not the best way of doing things. So in this case, Hatcher's argument, I don't think is very valid. Now, one of the final arguments is actually from then Senator Joe Biden, who of course is president now. He argues that term limits would have undermined the work of the framers. This is an interesting point because the framers established the Constitution, but as we know, they implemented Article 5 of the Constitution. Article 5 gives both the states and Congress the power to amend the Constitution. There have been 27 amendments that have been passed since. The framers recognized that the Constitution would not be perfect. It might have to change over time. So claiming that this work would undermine the framers, I don't believe that's a very valid argument. I hope by watching and listening to this video, you now have a more clear understanding of what congressional term limits are. It's a very complicated topic. It's deep into our country's history, and there's a lot to understand. But on the surface level, it's important to note that we don't have congressional term limits now. We do have presidential term limits. Those were added about 100 years ago, but we don't have congressional term limits. There are many pros, there are many cons. It's up to you to decide what you actually think. Now, personally, I believe congressional term limits would solve many of the problems that our country faces. In terms of the exact number of term limits, I would say that 4 two-year terms would be good for the House and 2 six-year terms would be good for the Senate. This would total to 20 years in Congress if someone were to be both a representative and a senator. I think this is more than enough time to get your agenda done, to get bills passed, and to represent your people. I don't think you need more than 20 years. If you look at our current Senate right now, some of these people have been serving for so long. The median age is so high relative to the actual median age of the United States. I just believe that these people have been serving for too long. It's time to give new people a chance. Now it's up to you to decide. I hope you synthesize the information I provided you today. And thanks for tuning in.